At its height, Cahokia supported a population comparable to the great cities of medieval Europe, its grand plazas and towering earthen mounds reshaping the Illinois River Valley into a center of power, ritual, and trade unseen in ancient North America. The scale alone demands a re-examination of what we thought we knew about the continent before contact. Welcome! Over the next 30 minutes, we will walk the packed earth of Monk's Mound, stand beneath the shadow of its monumental constructions, and listen for the faint echoes of a society that organized labor, governed complex rituals, and connected distant peoples across rivers and prairies. You will see how archaeologists piece together lives from pottery shards, post holes, and pollen, and how new methods, from aerial lidar to soil chemistry, reveal patterns hidden beneath centuries of forest. This is not simply a tale of mounds and artifacts. It is an investigation into how a thriving urban center rose, how daily life unfolded within its stockades, how markets and alliances spread its influence, and why, after centuries of prosperity, its fortunes changed. By the end of our journey you will understand the ingenuity behind Cahokia's engineering, the beliefs that shaped its public spaces, and the lessons its rise and decline offer to us today about resilience, leadership, and environmental change. Listen for the small details that bring people alive, the clack of a potter's tool, the scent of burning hickory on a winter morning, the organized rhythm of work crews hauling earth to raise a mound. We will meet the evidence of trade networks that reach the Gulf Coast and the Great Lakes, the signs of social stratification etched into burial practices, and the mysteries that still draw questions from scholars and communities alike. If you find this exploration meaningful, please consider subscribing for more slow, careful histories told with respect for the past. Now let us step across time and into the living pulse of Cahokia, where every ridge and trench holds a story waiting to be read. Hook and greeting, a city that vanished overnight. Cahokia was the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, a concentrated urban center of earthen pyramids, plazas, and timber streets set on the floodplain east of the Mississippi River. Hello! At its heart rose Monk's Mound, a terraced platform of compacted soil that dwarfs every other Native American earthwork on the continent. Its base covers an area roughly equal to several football fields. The site once included more than 120 earthen mounds arranged around a great central plaza, with timber circles used as solar observatories and long avenues that structured communal life. When later travelers first encountered the leveled fields and scattered rises, they saw not the smoke of hearths or the patterns of neighborhoods but islands of earth that seemed to have been left by some giant hand. The transition from bustling metropolis to open farmland appears abrupt in the historical record, and that suddenness supplies the hook, a city so large and sophisticated that to the eyes of later centuries it had vanished overnight. In truth, decline took place across generations. Yet the impression of disappearance is real, because the physical markers of everyday life, wooden houses, scaffolding, palisades, rotted or were reclaimed by floodplain grasses, and only the mounds remained to anchor memory. Life in Cahokia was densely social and intensely organized. Farmers cultivated corn, beans, and squash on surrounding fields, supplying the urban population with staples. Skilled people worked in specialized crafts. Shells carved into ornaments trace routes from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Plaza. Copper objects reveal connections with the Great Lakes. Mica and exotic stones point to trade with the Appalachian highlands. Artifacts from distant places lie in residential refuse as well as in high-status burials. The evidence is tangible and persistent, pottery styles clustered by neighborhood, hearths and storage pits, post holes marking the footprints of large communal buildings. Short bursts of construction alternated with seasons of planting and harvest. The city breathed, in that sense, like any organized human place. Power was expressed on earth as much as in speech. Platform mounds elevated houses of the elite and temples above the plaza. Labor for mound construction was mobilized on an immense scale, with people hauling baskets of soil to raise terraces and embankments that still hold their shape. Palisaded walls and stockades enclosed parts of the settlement, signaling both collective defense and social control. Ceremony punctuated the calendar, feasting left behind concentrations of animals' bones and burned maize. Human burials, sometimes interred within mound structures or beneath plaza surfaces, record differential treatment and elaborate mortuary rituals. These practices shaped an urban identity that married civic engineering with ritual spectacle. Archaeology has revealed everyday details that complicate the idea of a sudden annihilation. Signs of malnutrition in some skeletal remains coexist with rich grave goods in others. Evidence of repair and rebuilding appears alongside layers of abandonment. Environmental stresses show up in pollen cores and tree ring reconstructions, while geomorphological studies demonstrate episodes of flooding and river course change. Experts point to a constellation of pressures: resource depletion from intensive agriculture and fuel use, climatic variations that affected crop yields, periodic flooding, and likely social upheavals that progressively undermined Cahokia's capacity to support a large, concentrated population. Disease may have played a role, as can internecine conflict. No single cause fits every line of evidence, which is why the language of sudden disappearance is persuasive only at first glance. For those who study the site now, Cahokia is both a place of mysteries and of clarity. The scale of communal labor and the sophistication of urban planning are undeniable. The timber circles, often called woodhinge, align with solstices and equinoxes and reveal a community attentive to celestial rhythms. The Grand Plaza framed by mounds served as a stage for political theater and communal gatherings. Yet the lived reality of the city, the quotidian rhythms of child rearing, craft production, trade negotiations, and ritual obligations, is only reconstructed through careful excavation, laboratory analysis, and comparison with ethno-historic records. The impression of something erased overnight remains a compelling narrative device, but it is tempered by layers of material testimony that speak to gradual transformation. Today the earthen silhouettes of Cahokia command a different kind of attention. Archaeologists work alongside descendant communities to interpret the landscape with respect and nuance. Preservation efforts protect the surviving mounds from development, and public programs encourage visitors to read the site as a once thriving city rather than merely as isolated monuments. The lessons linger. A metropolis dependent on concentrated resources can be resilient, and yet vulnerable to combined pressures. Contemporary discussions of urban sustainability often return to this site as an ancient case study in the management of food, wood, and water across social and ecological boundaries. If this exploration resonates with you, consider subscribing for further stories that examine the lives behind the places we inherit. Thank you for listening. Geography of the Mississippi Valley. Hello. The broad alluvial plain known locally as the American Bottom, a wide ribbon of silt and clay lying across from present-day St. Louis in Collinsville, Illinois, provided the physical canvas upon which Cahokia rose. Rivers and tributaries braided through this lowland, depositing nutrient-rich sediment with each seasonal flood. The site sits near where the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois river systems converge, and that confluence shaped both landscape and opportunity in unmistakable ways. Fine windblown loess blanketed the higher bluffs that line the valley, creating stable, easily worked soils for construction. Alluvial deposits, meanwhile, formed terraces and natural levees close to the river channels, ideal for intensive cultivation. Backswamps and oxbow lakes were carved out as channels shifted, leaving wet basins that supported fish, waterfowl, and reed beds. Those wetlands were not merely obstacles, they were resources. Fisheries and wild rice stands, wetland birds, and abundant aquatic plants supplemented gardens and fields. The hydrology of the Mississippi Valley governed settlement patterns. Seasonal inundation deposited fresh silt that rejuvenated soils but also demanded adaptation. Communities placed their most important structures on higher ground and artificial elevations. Earthen platforms and plazas rose above the floodplain and offered dry, defensible cores. The shifting channels of the river created natural corridors for movement, yet they could also isolate neighborhoods when the water crept over lower terraces. People learned to read the land and to align pathways and causeways with stable ridges and remnant terraces. Beyond immediate subsistence, the valley served as a transportation network on an epic scale. Canoes moved easily along the Mississippi and up its tributaries, turning the river into a prehistoric interstate. Goods from distant regions appear in the archaeological record at Cahokia: marine shell ornaments from the Gulf Coast, native copper from the Great Lakes, high-quality chert from the Flint Ridge area, and mica likely from Appalachian sources. Those materials testify to long-distance exchange that the valley's waterways made practical and relatively rapid. Topography created micro-environments that communities exploited in different ways. The higher loess bluffs provided firm foundations for large constructions and easier drainage for habitation areas. The lower swales and backwater ponds concentrated wildlife and aquatic plant life and supplied clay for pottery manufacture. Upland prairies and mixed oak-hickory forests on the surrounding rims offered timber, nuts, and game. Together, these varied landscapes formed a mosaic of predictable resources within walking or paddling distance. Climatic rhythms further influenced land use. Warm growing seasons favored maize and other cultigens when planted on the fertile terrace soils near the river, while colder snaps and wet years tested planting strategies. Farmers used the naturally replenished soils of the floodplain to support intensive agriculture without modern fertilizers. Maize fields, bean patches, and squash gardens occupied different niches according to drainage and elevation. Hydrological variability demanded flexibility in crop placement and storage. The valley's geomorphology also shaped social organization. Neighborhoods and ceremonial precincts clustered on stable terraces, causeways linked lowland wards to upland ridges. Urban design reflected an intimate knowledge of the land's contours. Mound construction itself can be seen as both a response to an exploitation of the valley's form. Mounds provided raised, dry platforms in a landscape where flooding could quickly alter the lay of the land. Orientation of plazas and avenues echoed the lineaments of ancient river channels and remnant ridges. In the wider Mississippi Valley, major tributaries functioned as arms reaching into the continent's interior. The Missouri opened grassland and mountain corridors, the Ohio carried resources from the eastern woodlands, the Illinois linked Great Lakes drainage to the heartland. Cahokia's position near these arteries granted it access to floral and faunal zones that extended from Gulf marshes to boreal woodlands. That geographic advantage made the site a nexus for exchange, innovation, and confrontations of environment and culture. Modern observers can still see the marks of these processes in the landscape: meander scars in low fields, terraces that hold old farmsteads, and loess bluffs that shelter towns from seasonal floods. The valley's character, its deposits, channels, levees, swales, and bluffs, remains legible to those who study it closely. The geography of the Mississippi Valley was therefore neither backdrop nor mere resource. It was an active agent in shaping human choices, technologies, and networks. If this account has stirred your curiosity about how landscape and life intertwined at Cahokia and across the Mississippi Valley, please subscribe for more calm, detailed explorations. Founding of Cahokia. Hello. When the first dwellings rose on the broad, loess-covered terraces east of the Mississippi, they joined a landscape already shaped by centuries of riverine motion and human presence. A shallow ridge above the floodplain offered safety from high water and a vantage over the great river. That choice of ground mattered. The American bottom, a wide, fertile basin drained by shifting channels, provided rich alluvial soils and easy access to waterways that connected distant peoples. Small family farms, scattered hamlets, and seasonal camps had occupied this region for generations. Over time, those dispersed groups began to knot together into something far larger than a village. Evidence on pottery sherds and hearths indicates a gradual intensification of settlement. Houses grew closer. Fields expanded. Maize cultivation took root and then flourished, carried from farther south into a temperate environment through trade and gradual adoption. Yields rose as techniques adapted to local soils and climates, and suddenly food could support greater concentrations of people. That shift in subsistence underpinned social changes that follow like a tide. Archaeologists reconstruct this founding through layers of soil and charcoal, through radiocarbon samples, through fragments of bone and clay. They read pollen trapped in sediment and see the signatures of trees felled for fields and for timber. They find the earliest provable constructions, simple platform mounds, compacted by repeated human hands. Those first mounds were not monumental in the way later ones would be. They were intentional earthen rises, built by communities that knew how to move soil efficiently in baskets and to compact it into platforms suitable for houses or ceremonial use. The act of mound building itself tells us much about the social organization at the moment of founding. Labor had to be coordinated. Leadership must have existed to direct tasks. Yet evidence of household refuse and small domestic structures atop early mounds also suggests that the process began as an extension of everyday life, not a sudden imposition from afar. Material culture provides further clues to the composition and aspirations of the early community. Pottery styles, for example, change in ways that reflect both continuity with earlier woodland traditions and new innovations. Some types of decorated ceramics associated with Cahokia appear across broad regions, a sign of growing exchange networks. Exotic materials arrive, the white of marine shell from the Gulf Coast, the bright green of copper traceable to Great Lakes sources, mica likely from the Appalachians. These are not mere curiosities. They are gifts, trade goods, symbols. Their presence in early contexts implies a strategic location at the confluence of pathways. Goods moved along rivers, people moved with them. The rivers were highways, and Cahokia's founding took advantage of that fact. Leadership in the founding phase shows both subtlety and force. Burial practices begin to differentiate. While many individuals are interred within ordinary midden contexts, some graves are set apart with distinctive assemblages. One particularly striking example discovered later in the central precinct reveals an elite interment surrounded by carefully arranged grave goods and symbolic items, placed atop a specially prepared platform. Such burials attest to individuals who commanded resources and ritual authority. This hierarchical emergence did not occur in a vacuum. It was built on ritual performance, kin alliances, and control over surplus food. The plaza, an open, deliberately leveled space, became the stage on which these relationships were enacted. People gathered there for feasts, ceremonies, and political negotiations. The organization of the plaza alongside mounds marks the transformation of scattered households into a civic core. Construction of public spaces required shared labor and common purpose. It also required the ability to persuade or compel participation. Environmental adaptation was central to founding decisions. Seasonal flooding could be devastating, yet the river also brought replenishing sediments and a corridor for fish and waterfowl. Settlers learned where to plant and where to build. Houses occupied slightly raised natural terraces, gardens lay in the rich bottomlands. Archaeobotanical remains show the staples, maize, beans, squash, alongside wild resources exploited to supplement diet, freshwater fish, deer, and nuts. The result was a mixed economy that could support specialization. Craftspeople emerged who focused on pottery, stone tool production, and weaving. Specialized artisans made decorative shell beads and fine incised pottery that would travel far beyond the settlement. That specialization, in turn, fed hierarchical distinctions. Skilled hands produced luxury items for elite consumption and for exchange, reinforcing the social bonds that held a growing population together. The founding of such a place required planning on a grand scale. Long timber palisades and earthworks were laid out to define space, and the builders oriented their constructions with cosmological purpose. Post-circle alignments, what later investigators would call a wood hinge, appear in early phases, marking astronomical events and structuring the ritual calendar. The placement of mounds relative to the plaza, and the orientation of ceremonial spaces, reflects a worldview that linked the community to the cycles of sun and river. Ritual observance, agricultural timing, and political legitimacy were knotted together by those alignments. Leaders who could read the sky and orchestrate ceremonies gained prestige. Their authority rested as much on performance as on control of labor. The pace of growth in those founding years could be astonishing. Records of sequential construction show successive building episodes, where new layers of compacted earth covered previous levels, and plazas were regraded for further events. Houses were burned and rebuilt in plan patterns, refuse pits were dug and refilled. Such episodes suggest crises and renewals, periods of reorganization that may have accompanied demographic pressure, competitive display, or responses to climatic variability. Each new mound face and plaza layer testifies to human decisions made in the face of environmental and social challenge. Trade networks also buttressed the early community's rise. Runners, canoeists, and pack carriers brought items not found locally. The Gulf Coast shells tell a story of exchange with distant shorelines, where certain shell species were fashioned into beads and gorgets prized as status markers. Copper ornaments came from the north, hammered and shaped into crescents and plates. These materials were worked into regalia used in ceremonies and placed as offerings in burials. The presence of such goods in foundational contexts indicates that even in its early phase, the settlement was not insular. It acted as a hub, a place where goods and ideas converged. That convergence inspired innovation in crafts, in belief, and in political form. The social contract of founding was complex. People invested labor not only in fields but in earthworks, not only in houses but in communal projects that outlasted individual lifespans. Memory accrued in mounds and plazas. Leaders organized feasts which distributed surplus and reinforced allegiance. Such exchanges were practical and symbolic at once. A feast could mobilize hundreds to move soil for a new mound. The same feast could reaffirm kinship ties and declare a leader's capacity to provide. The archaeological signatures of those feasts, charred animal bone, burnt maize kernels, charred hickory nut fragments, are interleaved with build layers. There, the physical and the ceremonial meet. Founding stories, as much as archaeological data, shaped later perceptions of place. Oral traditions, while largely lost to time for this site, find echoes in motifs on ceramics and in the arrangement of public space. Iconography carved into ornaments and incised into pottery suggests a shared mythic repertoire, avian beings, composite creatures, and motifs linked to renewal and fertility. These images frequently appear alongside evidence of centralized activities. That is telling. The making of a city was as much the making of a shared imagination as it was the gathering of resources. Discipline in construction techniques gave the settlement endurance. Builders adopted methods to prevent erosion of earthen mounds, using compacted layers and vegetal capping. Drainage channels were incorporated where needed, and the choice of fill, from friable loess to river silt, was deliberate. Labor organization must have been sophisticated. People coordinated crews that excavated, transported, and rammed basket loads of soil into place, season after season. Children's bones, domestic pottery, and footpaths preserved between layers show the human scale of the enterprise. This was not monumental architecture imposed by anonymous forces, it was made by identifiable communities, day by day. Conflict and competition shaped founding dynamics too. The establishment and defense of space required planning against human rivals and environmental threats. Palisades and defensive embankments appear in some phases, indicating either concern for security or the ritual marking of sacred precincts. Warfare may have been episodic, with rival chiefdoms contesting access to resources and prestige goods. Yet cooperation between groups also appears in the shared styles of pottery and trade of goods. The founding of Cahokia therefore rested on a delicate balance of competition and cooperation, of display and exchange. As the first generations filled the area with houses and small mounds, they created a framework that would allow a rapid transformation into a metropolis. The founding phase set durable precedents, a central plaza flanked by mounds, a system of public architecture that codified social roles, and a network of exchange that extended to coasts and uplands alike. Those precedents would enable leaders to marshal greater labor, to centralize ritual authority, and to incorporate new populations through marriage and alliance. The physical choices made at founding, where to build, how to manage water, which crops to cultivate, determined the possibilities for growth. The archaeological record preserves the founding as palimpsest, layered earth, interrupted habitation surfaces, scattered shingles of flora and fauna. Each layer is a decision frozen in time. When we read that record carefully, specific episodes become visible. One early construction episode shows a modest plaza leveled and surrounded by low, compacted mounds. People gathered there for shared ceremonies, offering shells and carefully made pottery. Nearby, a house was dismantled and its timbers burned in what may have been a deliberate closing rite. Later, a larger mound rose on that same footprint, signaling a redefinition of space and authority. These concrete examples reveal a people experimenting with civic life and exploring the contours of political organization. Founding was thus at once practical and symbolic. The settlement's location, on a terrace above the river, within reach of trade routes, enabled the accumulation of surplus and the movement of goods. Agricultural intensification freed labor for public works. Social practices, from feasting to burial, created hierarchies and cemented alliances. Material culture reflected external connections and internal differentiation. And all of this unfolded in a rhythm governed by seasons, by the flood cycle, and by a communal calendar marked in wood posts and sunrises. Near the end of that formative era, the city's central precinct began to display hallmarks recognizable even to later visitors: large platform mounds, a grand plaza, and evidence of long-distance exchange. The founding decisions, where to lay the first houses, when to clear the first fields, how to orient the first posts, had multiplied into a complex urban organism. People who lived through those founding decades left behind a landscape designed to hold memory, to stage power, and to sustain a populous and vibrant community. Thank you for listening. If this account drew you into the deep past and you would like more narratives that explore these ancient places with care, please consider subscribing for future stories. Urban planning and mounds. Hello. The first thing a visitor senses at Cahokia is the deliberate shaping of the land itself: great terraces and raised platforms that organize space as surely as any street carved from stone. Walkers find a sweeping plaza laid flat and level, edged by earthen terraces and the monumental rise that is Monk's Mound, which dominates the central skyline. From this vantage the city reads as a plan, not as a scatter of habitations, and the mounds function as both anchors and statements within that plan. They define sightlines and processional routes, knit neighborhoods to ceremonial centers, and create a layered cityscape where ritual, residence, and authority are articulated in earth and timber. Archaeologists have revealed layers of intent in the way these earthworks were placed and built. The Grand Plaza, a vast formal open space, was bounded by mounds oriented to create a sense of enclosure and direction. Large platform mounds were regularly situated at the plaza's perimeter, facing inward toward the public arena. Conical mounds, often used for burials or commemorative deposits, cluster in ways that suggest family or lineage plots within the broader urban plan. There is a rhythm to the spacing: long, low ridgetop mounds linked to travel corridors, steep-sided platform mounds rising near plazas, and timber circles, known today as wood henges, set at measured distances where the sun's passage could be marked. This was not accidental. The placement of mounds orchestrated movement through the city. Processions moved from plaza to mound top, and the tops of mounds served as stages for ceremony and governance. Construction techniques themselves reveal a disciplined approach to urban engineering. Earth was brought in basket loads, piled, and then tamped in successive layers, creating dense, stratified deposits that resist erosion even centuries later. Excavations show clear stratigraphy, alternating layers of topsoil, clay, and sod used to stabilize slopes, with careful shaping into terraces and ramps that allowed access to the summit. Builders used berms and compacted layers to create flat building platforms capable of supporting large timber structures. The scale of some mounds implies sustained, organized labor and logistical systems for sourcing and transporting soil across distances. Work was communal, and the evidence of repeated episodes of construction, additions, refurbishments, and terracing speaks to an ongoing civic investment in the city's central spaces. Monk's Mound, the largest of these, encapsulates the intersection of urban planning and monumental architecture. Its terraces were not merely decorative, they defined usable level areas atop a massive artificial elevation, suitable for public buildings and elite residencies. Post-hole patterns at the summit suggest substantial wooden structures, likely temples or houses of leaders, oriented to face the Grand Plaza below. Ramps and causeways provided formal approaches, channeling movement and sight so that gatherings in the plaza could be observed from above. The mound's multi-layered construction shows successive episodes of expansion and renovation, indicating that planning at Cahokia was dynamic. The city's layout evolved in response to changing ceremonial needs and social structures, but always through intentional shaping of earth and space. Other mounds played complementary roles. Platform mounds across the site acted as podiums for civic or ritual architecture, while burial mounds recorded the social memory of individuals and groups. Some mounds contain caches of artifacts, copper ornaments, shell beads, and tools, placed in structured deposits that reaffirmed certain social ties. The ritual landscape extended beyond the central plaza to include peripheral mound groups, residential terraces, and open fields. Neighborhoods show patterns of small, compact house foundations arranged along formalized pathways and near smaller mounds that created local centers of communal life. In this way, the metropolis balanced centralized ceremonial space with distributed local nodes, each connected through a coherent system of earthworks. Astronomical alignment and temporal coordination were woven into the plan. Timber circles, ringed enclosures of upright posts, functioned as solar observatories, marking solstices and equinoxes and likely informing the timing of agricultural and ritual activities. The axes of plazas and some mound alignments correspond to these sightlines. Streets and causeways oriented to cardinal directions and to riverine approaches guided trade and procession. A palisade that once encircled parts of the central area defined a boundary between the sacred precinct and the broader community. It also regulated movement into central spaces, channeling visitors and participants through designated gateways and approach corridors. Urban planning at Cahokia thus integrated cosmology, defense, circulation, and ceremony into a single, legible landscape. Surveys and geophysical studies have deepened understanding of the city's plan without disturbing the earthworks. Magnetometry, ground-penetrating radar, and detailed topographic mapping reveal buried features, post holes, former building footprints, and the buried remains of plazas that indicate a grid of streets and alleys. Artifact distributions found within those buried streets show concentrated craft areas where flint knappers, potters, and metalworkers worked near designated workshops, while food preparation zones and refuse pits lay along predictable hinterlands. The landscape plan accommodated craft specialization and daily life within a framework that elevated certain spaces above others for communal and ceremonial uses. The social meaning of mounds is inseparable from their physical form. Platform mounds created stages for leadership, projecting visibility and authority across the plaza. Burial mounds marked ancestry and continuity, serving as mnemonic anchors in the urban fabric. The layering of soil and the inclusion of ceremonial materials signal deliberate acts of remembrance and politics. The city's plan therefore served an ideological purpose. It arranged the populace spatially in ways that reinforce social hierarchies, ritual rhythms, and communal identity. Paths converged on plazas. Eyes were drawn upward to mound summits. From those summits, leaders could oversee both commerce and ceremony, sustaining a visible connection between rulership and sacred performance. A closer look at construction rituals illuminates how planning and mounds were enacted through labor and ceremony. Workers shaped ditches, hauled soil from borrow pits, and laid the earth while communities gathered. Archaeologists have found compacted surfaces and traces of temporary floors at mound summits, suggesting that ceremonies accompanied construction, assemblies, feasting, the installation of posts, and that building was a social event as much as an engineering project. Layered deposits sometimes contain intentional inclusions, charcoal from ritual fires, food remains, or special artifacts placed as dedications. The act of building fused practical tasks with symbolic intent, embedding cultural meaning into the very stones and soils of the city. The use of space over time demonstrates planning principles applied across generations. Some mounds show evidence of reuse. A mound might begin as a burial or commemorative cone and later be augmented into a platform for buildings. Such transformations reveal adaptive planning, where the landscape accommodated shifting political or religious needs without abandoning earlier commitments to place. Neighborhoods changed as new mounds were added or terraces regrade. Yet the underlying logic, central plaza, dominant platform mounds, oriented processional ways, remained recognizable. It is an urban grammar that governed how people organized their daily lives and their shared rituals. Material culture found within and around mounds helps to map social connections across the urban plan. Imported materials, marine shell, copper from distant sources, exotic stone, appear in concentrated caches on mound summits and in burial contexts, indicating long-distance exchange networks that were tied into the city's ceremonial core. Artisans' debris fields cluster in peripheral craft areas, while elite paraphernalia concentrates atop platform mounds. These patterns suggest an economy integrated with ceremonial practice. Surplus and exotic goods were funneled to the center, displayed in ritual contexts, and redistributed in ways that reinforce social bonds. The design of the city thus supported both economic activity and ideological reinforcement. Preservation of the earthworks has allowed modern visitors and scholars to read the plan in the landscape itself. Even where surface features have been altered, buried features and subtle contours tell of roads and plazas, of terraces and rampways deliberately shaped to channel vision and movement. The terraces of major mounds frame the skyline. The flatness of plaza surfaces emphasizes communal gathering. The arrangement of smaller mounds and house depressions forms neighborhoods that were both practical and socially meaningful. The endurance of these features is a testament to skilled construction and long-term civic stewardship. Interpretations of Cahokia's planning emphasize both its uniqueness and its integration into broader indigenous traditions of mound building. Similar principles, platforms for public buildings, burial mounds marking ancestral claims, plazas as public arenas, appear across the region, but Cahokia's scale and coherence are exceptional. Its plan demonstrates a refined understanding of landscape control and a capacity to marshal labor for long-term projects. The city's designers arranged forms to be seen from many vantage points. Ceremonial axes and sightlines were chosen to align seasonal cycles with civic ritual. The mounds were not isolated monuments but parts of a living urban organism, each contributing to circulation, visibility, and memory. As one moves through the site today, the choreography of space becomes apparent. Paths that lie between mounds invite a slow procession. The low hum of wind across terrace edges can be imagined as the murmur of past crowds. From a distance the mounds read as a skyline of deliberate peaks. From the summit of a platform mound the plaza unfolds and the web of causeways becomes legible. That experience, of being both enclosed and open, of moving through framed vistas, is precisely what the planners intended. They made the city in such a way that social life would play out against a backdrop of carefully shaped earth. This is a story about planning as a social technology, a set of practices that organized labor, ritual, economy, and memory into a coherent urban form. Mounds were both repositories of the past and stages for the present. They held burials, yes, but they also held meetings, housed temples and residences, and disciplined the flow of people across the floodplain. The sequence of terraces and plazas produced sightlines that made power visible. Every ramp and alignment carried meaning, and every mound articulated a role within a larger civic system. Thank you for listening. If this account stirred your curiosity and you would like more explorations of landscape and ancient urban design, please subscribe for further narratives. Religion and power. Hello. When archaeologists exposed the terraces and buried plazas of Cahokia, they revealed a landscape shaped as much by ritual architecture as by political design. The largest earthen platforms rose like stages set for ceremonies, their flat summits once supporting timber buildings where the city's leaders performed rites visible to thousands. A circle of posts known as the woodhinge stood nearby, aligning with solstices and equinoxes and serving as a public astronomical instrument that fixed time for ritual life. Public and private duties overlapped here, religion was woven into governance until the two were nearly indistinguishable. Power at Cahokia was enacted through visible ritual. The great platform mounds, notably the massive central mound and its satellite embankments, were not simple burial hills. They were podiums for spectacle and authority, places where the elite displayed regalia, received tribute, and staged ceremonies that bound large populations to a shared cosmology. On the plazas below, feasts and dances took place in view of these elevated stages. The stage and the stagecraft mattered. A ruler who could command labor to raise monumental earthworks could also command belief, because the construction itself was a continual demonstration of control over people, resources, and sacred time. Evidence from specialized burials clarifies how religion bolstered rulership. One prominent mound yielded the remains of a single individual accompanied by an astonishing concentration of marine shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird, a powerful motif of the wider southeastern ceremonial complex. Around that central interment lay other humans and ornate offerings, some placed in deliberate patterns that suggest acts of dedication or sacrifice. These burials spoke of leaders who claimed supernatural lineage or favor, leaders whose identities were encoded in iconography and careful burial practice. The burial pattern sent a message. They declared that certain lives were central to the community's relationship with the cosmos, and that others might be ritually bound to those central lives. Material flow played into spiritual authority as well. Exotic goods, marine shell from distant coasts, copper reflecting broad trade connections, mica, and other prized minerals transported from far beyond the floodplain, appeared in ritual contexts. When such objects were displayed in ceremonies or interred with leaders, they became sacred tokens of connection and control. The possession of these items signaled access to people and places beyond the city, and conferment of them in ritual contexts signaled redistribution and obligation. The leaders who curated these objects thus acted as intermediaries between the local and the wider world, between the earthly flows of goods and the imagined realms of power. The wood hinge was both a clock and a spectacle. Its timber posts marked sunlight's passage, and the predictable return of the sun at certain posts structured ceremonial calendars. When the sun rose behind a particular post on a particular day, public gatherings would confirm a cosmological order. Those who could interpret and orchestrate such celestial events held a form of knowledge-based authority. Ritual specialists, priestly figures, ritual chiefs, or both, used these moments to legitimize political acts, the inauguration of leaders, the distribution of prizes, the enactment of alliances and punishments. In short, control of sacred time meant control of public action. Public ritual required labor, and labor required organization. The terraces, ramps, and plazas did not rise spontaneously. They were the product of organized workforces, food provisioning, and sustained leadership. Leaders choreographed seasonal cycles of work and celebration, coordinating farmers, artisans, and warriors into collective projects. Mass feasting, evidenced by large deposits of food remains and butchering waste, served both to redistribute resources and to ritualize authority. Commoners who received food at a public ceremony experienced a tangible expression of elite power. They ate the leader's generosity, and in doing so were reminded of the social order that made those meals possible. Iconography reinforced ideological claims. The bird motif, the so-called birdman, and other recurring images connected Cahokian ritual to a broader network of symbolism shared across the Mississippian world. In carvings, shell gorgets, and ceremonial objects, motifs of flight, water, and warrior heroism interwove cosmological themes, the sky, the river, and the underworld. These images were more than decoration. They were a visual grammar of authority. Wearing, displaying, or controlling such symbols elevated a person's status by connecting them to mythic narratives of creation, renewal, and martial prowess. Sacrifice and violence appeared in archaeological contexts in ways that complicate modern interpretations of Cahokia's religious life. Some burials near the central mound included individuals who had been placed in positions and patterns suggesting ritual killing or ritual service in death, rather than purely accidental violence or battlefield casualties. The presence of carefully arranged secondary burials, and remains placed in ritual postures, indicate that death itself could be part of political theater. The execution or sacramental killing of individuals might have operated to demonstrate the ruler's control over life and death, to sanctify a new leadership, or to consecrate monumental construction. Such acts would have been potent communicators of social boundaries. Ceremony also served diplomatic ends. Pageantry, processions, ritualized gift exchanges, and the public display of symbols created a language for alliances and rivalries. Distant chiefs who accepted offerings or emblems of Cahokia acknowledged a cosmological order that placed Cahokia at its center. That order rested upon shared ritual practices and narratives that linked disparate communities into a political-religious network. In turn, Cahokia's leaders could mobilize regional loyalties during times of stress, drawing on those ritual ties in ways that were both spiritual and strategic. Power was contested within these religious frames as well. The archaeological record shows shifts in construction patterns, abrupt changes in the use of ceremonial spaces, and episodes where previously central plazas were filled or abandoned. Such transformations suggest that religious authority was not static but negotiated. Competing factions, environmental pressures, or failures in ritual performance might have undermined the capacity of leaders to command labor and loyalty. If ritual efficacy faltered, if crop cycles failed despite ritual observance, or if celestial events were misinterpreted, the sacred claims of rulers could be weakened, and political realignment could follow. Women and men occupied ritual roles that intersected with political authority in complex ways. Grave goods, burial placement, and skeletal evidence indicate differentiated status and specializations. Certain burials reveal women with ornate adornments placed in contexts that imply public ritual function. Other burials indicate warriors or ritual specialists whose accoutrements mark them as agents of both spiritual and temporal power. The plurality of roles suggests that religious authority could be gendered and distributed, even as it concentrated symbolic power in a ruling core. Memory and placemaking were crucial to authority. The landscape itself carried stories, raised causeways, riverfront platforms, and mounds that framed the daily passage of life. Leaders curated these stories through ritual practice, turning the city into a palimpsest of myth and governance. Pilgrimage to sacred mounds, participation in seasonal rites, and engagement in communal labor all reaffirmed the social contract between ruler and ruled. In this way, religion functioned as social infrastructure, an indispensable medium through which leadership was made visible, contested, and renewed. Archaeological science continues to refine the picture without resolving all questions. Botanical and faunal remains illuminate feast contexts. Stratigraphy reveals episodes of construction and reworking. Iconographic parallels map ideological connections across the region. Each line of evidence emphasizes the same point: religion and power at Cahokia were braided together, each enhancing the other. Leaders drew on ritual to mobilize labor and loyalty, and ritual depended on leaders to provide the stage and the goods that made belief publicly persuasive. The city's sacred architecture and ceremonial life were thus instruments of rule. They created a shared world in which leaders interpreted cosmic order, presided over its enactment, and distributed the material signs of connection to that order. The signs were many: the alignment of post circles with sunrise, the shell garb dead in platform mounds, the plume and beak motifs carved into stone and shell, the great communal meals that fed and bound the populace. Together these practices forged a polity in which theology and governance were not separate spheres but mutually constitutive aspects of social power. If this narrative holds, then the fallibility of ritual authority also explains vulnerability. When the flows of exchange slowed, when social consensus fractured, or when leaders failed to produce the expected cosmological outcomes, the religious basis for centralized power could erode. Yet the material legacy remained. The mounds continued to shape the land and memory. Their stones and soil kept the story of a people who had linked the sacred and the political with enduring force. If you found this account engaging, please consider subscribing for more explorations of ancient landscapes and the human dramas they hold. Trade networks. The great river carried objects, languages, and power along its braids and backwaters, and Cahokia stood where those currents met. Hello. Long before metal ships or mapped highways, people moved things by hand and by canoe, and the materials that gathered beneath Cahokia's mounds tell a clear story of reach and connection. Shells cut from Gulf whelks gleamed alongside hammered copper from the far north. Smooth sheets of mica, thin as the skin of a pond at dawn, came from highland sources to the east. Chert and flint from the Ozark uplands and carved stone pipes whose material origins trace hundreds of miles away lay buried with leaders and placed on platforms where the city ceremonies played out. Archaeologists have traced many of these items to distant sources by chemistry and form. The routes were rivers and portage trails, and the items moved in the hands of specialists, pilgrims, and traders. The Mississippi and its tributaries were not passive features of the landscape. They were highways, arteries of exchange that linked coastal communities with upland villages and connected Cahokia to a continent-spanning web. Follow a conch shell and one can see how the network functioned. From coastal workshops along the Gulf of Mexico, artisans prepared shell to be shaped into gorgets, beads, and inlays. The shell's journey was circuitous. It passed from village to village, sometimes as finished ornament and sometimes as raw material, moving inland along rivers where canoe crews traded fish, salt, and textile. Short legs of barter connected neighbors. Longer legs connected communities that specialized in particular crafts. At Cahokia, these shells became symbols, set into necklaces for high-status burials, worked into decorative panels, or displayed in public rituals atop palisaded plazas. The presence of shell artifacts in the city was both economic and political. The exotic material reinforced social distinctions and affirmed the city's place at the center of exchange. Not everything arriving at Cahokia was purely decorative. Raw copper, worked into plates and ear ornaments, arrived from the region around the Great Lakes. The metal was cold and heavy at first, then warmed by hammer and anneal into thin sheets embossed with complex motifs. Such objects appear across the Mississippian world, connecting sites like Spiro in the lower plains and Etowah farther south. Mica, sourced from Appalachia's crystalline veins, appeared in funerary contexts and may have reflected cosmological significance, shimmering in burial chambers and catching torchlight during rites. These materials did not simply travel on merchant wagons, they moved within networks structured by kinship ties, ritual affiliation, and political alliances. Cahokia's leaders gained leverage by controlling the flow of prestige goods, by deciding who received certain ornaments and who did not. The architecture of exchange left its imprint on the cityscape. Areas identified by archaeologists as craft quarters contained concentrations of production debris, shellworking flakes, copper hammering detritus, grinding stones, and the broken remains of pottery destined for shipment. These were places where raw inputs were transformed into socially meaningful products. Some items were mass-produced for broader circulation, while others, elaborate ceremonial objects, were created in restricted workshops for elite use. Short trade trips supplied quotidian needs. Long journeys supplied ideology. The two operated side by side. Rivers dictated choices about movement. Canoe travel was efficient for bulky goods like copper and salt. Portage trails connected watersheds where necessary, and small inland paths carried specialized materials between neighboring communities. The reach of Cahokia's networks can be seen in artifact parallels hundreds of miles distant. Iconography linked via the southeastern ceremonial complex, staffs, raptorial bird imagery, and certain motifs appears across sites, signaling shared religious language. Such shared imagery suggests not simply economic exchange but the transmission of ideas and ceremonial practice, carried on the same currents that carried shells and copper. Trade at Cahokia was not a free market of anonymous buyers and sellers. It operated within bespoke networks of obligation. Gifts and feasts formalized relationships. Leaders hosted visitors and redistributed goods in public ceremonies, creating reciprocal debts that bound regions to the city. Archaeological evidence of large-scale feasting, bone beds, concentrations of domestic refuse, and expansive plaza spaces speaks to a system where surplus food and exotic goods reinforced alliances. When chiefs distributed rare shells or copper plates during rites, they translated access to foreign materials into political capital. Evidence from burial contexts clarifies this dynamic. High-status burials placed near the central mounds contained carefully curated assortments of exotic items, indicating that access to interregional trade provided visible markers of rank. These assemblages often included combinations of materials from different directions, Gulf shells and northern copper together, mica from the east and chert from the Ozarks. Such combinations show that Cahokia functioned as a hub where distinct trade lines converged and where the appropriation and recombination of materials helped produce authority. Intersite relationships further illuminate the network. Cahokia's influence is seen in the diffusion of architectural practices, large platform mounds, palisaded plazas, and alignments of civic space, and in the movement of specific artifact types. Spiro mounds in the plains, Etoa in the southeast, and Moundville farther to the south shared objects and iconography with Cahokia, suggesting multifaceted ties between polities. These were not merely conveyor belts of goods, they were dialogic relationships. A copper plate moved from the Great Lakes to Cahokia might later appear further south at Etoa, having passed through multiple custodians, each leaving traces in style or repair. The social lives of objects mattered, materials acquired meaning as they changed hands. Craft specialization also underpinned the network's efficiency. Some communities excelled at shell carving, others at copper working or fine pottery. Labor could be mobilized seasonally, and artisans might travel to centers like Cahokia during periods of high demand. The city's size and organizational complexity enabled it to maintain stores of prestige items and raw materials, to host traveling specialists, and to orchestrate redistribution on a scale smaller villages could not. That capacity, in turn, bolstered Cahokia's centrality. Transport costs and risk structured what moved and why. Bulky goods traveled along predictable waterways, while small, high-value items, beads, ornaments, could be carried overland by traders or pilgrims. The rarity of certain materials magnified their symbolic value. A single piece of hammered copper could symbolize a network reaching to the north, a cluster of shell beads signaled ties to the Gulf and the Atlantic coast. These items functioned as both economic assets and communicative tokens, coding relationships in metal and mollusk. Political instability affected trade routes. Societal shifts altered who controlled which paths and who enjoyed privileged access to specific goods. When communities transformed, through warfare, environmental change, or political realignment, exchange patterns shifted accordingly. The archaeological record shows fluctuating intensities of exotic materials at different periods, indicating that the network was resilient but responsive. New alliances arose where old ones faltered, and trade adapted to changing centers of power. The people who moved goods were also carriers of knowledge. Technological practices, how to hammer copper thin without fracturing it, how to drill delicate shell beads, how to temper pottery with shell, spread alongside objects. Apprentices learned techniques from visiting artisans. Ceremonial forms migrated with priests and craft specialists. In this way, Cahokia's trade network was also a channel for craft innovation and religious exchange. The story preserved in Cahokia's artifacts is one of both reach and reciprocity. Not all exchange flowed into the city. Cahokia produced ceramics, textiles, and foodstuffs that found markets across the region. Surplus agricultural production supported specialists and facilitated long-distance exchange. Trade was embedded in subsistence and social organization, not separate from it. The exchange of goods reinforced the redistribution that legitimized leaders and sustained large urban populations. Closer examination of specific artifact classes shows subtlety in interaction. Portable stone effigy pipes carved from non-local materials sometimes bear motifs that reveal stylistic blending, an amalgam of local traditions and foreign influences. Such objects demonstrate negotiated identities. People in Cahokia both adopted external symbols and adapted them to local languages of power. The networks thus created cultural hybridity as well as material movement. In the end, Cahokia's trade networks were not merely economic webs, they were lines of connection that structured belief, authority, and community across a vast landscape. Objects found beneath mounds and in house floors speak of canoes sliding silently at dawn, of hands skilled at coaxing shine from copper, and of gatherings where the exchange of an item sealed an alliance. The materials themselves retain echoes of those contacts, the Gulf in a shell, the Great Lakes in a copper sheen, the Appalachians in a sheet of mica. Together they form a map of contact drawn in the language of artifacts. Thank you for taking this journey through objects and rivers. If this exploration of Cahokia's far-reaching connection spoke to you, please subscribe for more calm, careful narratives of the past. Daily life. A traveler stepping into Cahokia at dawn would have found a skyline defined by massive earthen mounds, a wide central plaza, and a ring of wooden posts marking the calendar for the sun. Hello. The daily rhythm here was organized by work, ritual, and the seasons, what people ate, how they moved, and where they lived tied closely to the layout of the city itself. Men and women rose to tasks shaped by agriculture and craft. Cornfields spread beyond the palisade, their stalks tended with careful hoeing and constant weeding. Short breaks punctuated long days of labor. Children walked alongside elders, learning to plant, to harvest, to tend the soils that sustained the community. The staple of the diet was maize, processed on stone manos and metods by hands that had practiced the grinding motion for years. Pottery vessels simmered over fires, their shapes pressed by skilled fingers, thick-walled cooking bowls held stews of corn, beans, and squash, often reaching the table with smoked fish or venison. Salted and dried foods were stored for the leaner months. Teeth and bones left behind tell of a heavy reliance on cultivated plants, supplemented by the riches of riverine trade and nearby woodlands. Houses clustered in neighborhoods of compact, rectangular wattle and daub structures with thatched roofs, each hearth a focal point for family life. A single structure might serve as kitchen, sleeping chamber, and workshop. Long workbenches inside these homes bore the marks of repeated use, notches for holding hides, stains from dyes, and scorched patches from pots. The workbench was also a school. Apprentices, often children of the family, learned to shape clay by pinching and coiling, to knap chert into fine projectile points, and to twist plant fibers into cordage. Skill passed slowly, mastery was a community resource rather than a private pursuit. The larger complex of Cahokia supported specialized production beyond the household level. Potters fired their wares in open kilns, fashioning utilitarian jars and more ornate pieces decorated with incised lines and stamped patterns. Shell workers polished marine shells into beads and gorgets. The swirl motifs and bird images that appear on these ornaments reveal both aesthetic preference and long-distance connection, as many shells came from hundreds of miles away. Copper items, hammered and shaped without melting, attested to trade networks that carried raw materials from the north. Flint knappers worked near constantly, shaping points not just for hunting but for ritual exchange. Markets likely arose near the plaza where goods could be bartered. Traders arriving by canoe brought freshwater fish and lake copper, while runners carried goods along established trails. Ceremony threaded through ordinary life. The central plaza was not merely an open space but the stage for feasts, dances, athletic contests, and public announcements. The game of chun-ki, played with polished stone discs and long spears, combined athleticism and social theater. Men and women watched and wagered, and the game could bind rival kin groups together. At sunrise, the concentric alignment of the timber circle, woodhinge, provided the calendar signals that timed plantings and festivals. Short rituals accompanied lengthy tasks and marked the passing of agricultural cycles. Leaders dwelling atop platform mounds presided over ceremonies and redistributed goods, and their actions affected the daily subsistence of many. Labor organization was visible in the landscape. The palisade, a stout wooden stockade that enclosed parts of the city, required continuous maintenance and occasional repair. When timber needed felling, entire groups coordinated to haul beams into place. Short directives and long communal efforts went hand in hand. Construction of mounds demanded coordinated labor as well. Soil carried in baskets created terraces and platforms that elevated houses and temples above the surrounding neighborhoods. These elevated structures served practical roles in flood-prone territory, as well as symbolic ones that reinforce social hierarchy. Children learned through imitation and participation. From dawn they practiced simple tasks, small hands rolling clay, learning to hold a chisel, helping sort seeds, and as they grew, responsibilities increased. Education was pragmatic, focused on transmission of craft technique, knowledge of plant cycles, and the stories that knit families and clans together. Storytelling took place by the hearth and during night watches, and elders recited genealogies and origin tales that anchored social identity. Short, functional songs and chants accompanied work, keeping rhythm while tasks stretched long. Food procurement blended cultivated and wild resources. Fish were caught in the river, cleaned and smoked on racks for preservation. Waterfowl were snared by skilled hunters using nets and decoys, and deer drives in nearby woods yielded meat and hide. Gardens near home supported beans and squash grown together with corn, a planting technique that supported soil fertility and dietary balance. Short forays into wetlands brought wild rice and tubers, while nuts and berries were collected seasonally. Processing these foods occupied women primarily, though men assisted during intensive harvests and large communal feasts. Dress and adornment signaled status and affiliation. Most people wore woven textiles and garments of animal hide suited to daily chores, but special occasions called for finer items, beaded necklaces, shell pendants, and painted body ornamentation. The elite displayed distinctive regalia during public ceremonies, sometimes brought forth on raised platforms. Short gestures such as the presentation of a decorated bowl or a ceremonial staff carried meaning that echoed through social networks. Health in the community reflected both the strengths and strains of urban life. Evidence of repetitive stress in bones, dental cavities from a maize-rich diet, and healed injuries shows a population that worked hard and sometimes suffered. Midwives and healers employed herbal knowledge and practical remedies. Some graves contained objects placed with the deceased, shells, pottery, beads, suggesting beliefs about care extending beyond life, and the community often responded collectively to illness and loss. The river was the lifeline. Canoes slid silently along the Mississippi and its tributaries, carrying people, ideas, and goods. A trader might arrive with Gulf shells or an unusual copper piece. Within days the object could be reshaped or imitated by local craftsmen, then redistributed. Short meetings at the riverbank could spawn long-lasting alliances. When floods rose, residents worked together to protect gardens and storage pits. The city's planners chose elevated mounds for key structures partly because of this hydrological wisdom. Daily life was regulated by both visible authorities and informal networks. Officials coordinated labor, but kinship and communal obligations often determined who did what and when. A mother's sister might help care for a newborn, while neighbors pooled labor for a large barn raising or mound repair. Festivals redistributed food and wealth, smoothing tensions and reinforcing loyalties. Short rituals could resolve disputes, a public apology or a shared meal had real consequences. Evenings carried their own rhythm, fires flickered under thatched roofs, voices dropped to low conversations, and the scent of smoked meat lingered in the air. People mended tools by lantern light, repaired nets, and planned the next day's tasks. The night sky, unpolluted by modern glare, guided travel and inspired stories. In quieter moments, someone might trace designs into a pot in progress or practice flute melodies that accompanied lullabies. Long-standing patterns of work, rest, ceremony, folded into the cadence of everyday life until they felt natural, like the lines on an old face. If you have enjoyed this quiet passage into the routines and rituals of an ancient city, please subscribe for more measured journeys through the past. Thank you for listening. Environmental stress. River channels braided and shifted across the floodplain that supported a remarkable concentration of people and monumental earthworks. Hello. The location that made Cahokia possible, rich alluvial soils, abundant water, and a nexus of river routes, also carried the seeds of ecological strain as human demands multiplied within a confined landscape. At the heart of the matter lay intensive maize agriculture. Archaeological chemistry and isotopic studies from human remains show a heavy reliance on C4 crops consistent with maize cultivation, and pollen records from nearby wetlands reveal a marked increase in cultivated plant signatures alongside a decline in native forest pollen. Forest clearing for fields and fuel removed the stabilizing root systems of oaks, hickories, and other hardwoods, exposing topsoils to the forces of rain and seasonal runoff. Erosion followed, and the once deep, dark lerces that had supported multiple harvests began to attenuate in places where agriculture pressed too intensively against the land. Flood dynamics of the Mississippi and its tributaries exacerbated these problems. Sediment cores and stratigraphic layers at habitation and construction sites preserve episodes of inundation and rapid deposition, indicating that parts of the city and its agricultural plots were periodically swamped. Floods could lay down thick layers of sand and silt, burying gardens, altering drainage, and forcing people to rework or abandon fields. At the same time, artificial terrace building and raised habitation mounds illustrate local strategies to cope with water, but these labor-intensive solutions could not completely remove the hazard where whole floodplain geomorphology was shifting. The pressure on faunal and aquatic resources added another dimension to environmental stress. Faunal assemblages from midden deposits indicate changes in exploited species over time. Freshwater mussel beds that once yielded abundant protein were heavily harvested, leaving fewer shells and altering riverbed conditions. Hunting patterns shifted as nearby populations of deer and other game within easy range were reduced, pushing hunters to travel farther and rely more on domesticated or intensively managed food supplies. This narrowing of subsistence options made the community more vulnerable when climatic variability or river shifts interrupted maize yields. Sanitation and urban density posed hidden challenges. The concentration of thousands of inhabitants within palisaded precincts and around the central plazas meant that waste management, water quality, and the maintenance of clean living spaces became critical. Archaeologists have documented discrete refuse pits and concentrated midden areas. These contain food remains, broken pottery, and evidence of human activity that, if not managed, could have led to localized contamination, pest proliferation, or disease vectors. High population density also amplified the demand for construction timber, fuel, and building materials, accelerating local resource depletion. Social responses to environmental stress are visible in the built record. The construction of defensive palisades and stockades around neighborhoods suggests competition for resources and a need to protect arable land and stored harvests. Large-scale earth-moving projects, from the massive earthen platform mounds to engineered causeways and terraces, reveal attempts to organize the landscape to human advantage, controlling water, marking territory, and creating stratified spaces for production and ceremony. Yet such monumental investment could have diverted labor from food production and ecosystem maintenance at critical moments. Trade and exchange networks offered both relief and vulnerability. Cahokia's position at riverine crossroads enabled the import of raw materials and foodstuffs when local supplies faltered. Exotic lithics, marine shell, and other non-local items found in burials and households attest to sustained long-distance connections. Reliance on such networks, however, meant that disruptions, whether social or environmental, could have ripple effects, reducing the community's capacity to adapt when multiple stresses coincided. In the final measure, the archaeological record suggests that environmental stress at Cahokia was not a single cause but a complex interplay: agricultural intensification, deforestation, erosion, flood disturbance, reduced biodiversity of wild resources, and the strains of urban life combined to challenge resilience. People adapted in myriad ways, altering fields, constructing earthworks, shifting diets, and engaging in trade, but those adaptations had limits. When climatic fluctuations aligned with degraded soils and strained resource bases, the balance that once supported a dense urban polity became precarious. Thank you for joining this account. If you find these stories enlightening, please consider subscribing for more calm, careful examinations of past places and the environmental forces that shaped them. Collapse and abandonment. Hello. When early investigators mapped the Great Plaza and the rising terraces of Earth near the Mississippi, they recorded a city that once rivaled the largest urban centers of its time north of Mexico. Archaeological evidence shows that Cahokia grew quickly into a monumental center with packed plazas, earthen mounds, and a dense population sustained by intensive maize agriculture. At its high point, construction projects ceased and the cultural signals that had marked power and cohesion began to fray. The end was not a single instant but a complex unraveling visible in soil layers, burned timbers, pollen records, and the burial practices left behind. Excavations reveal a clear pattern: the vibrant pulse of building and ritual gradually dimmed. Large-scale mound construction halted. The central plaza, once swept and rearranged for seasons of ceremony, accumulated fewer artifacts and less evidence of regular communal activity. Pottery styles shifted and then disappeared from the stratigraphic sequence. Everyday objects grew scarce in the contexts that had once been thick with refuse from daily life and elite feasting. These archaeological silences speak as loudly as the objects that remain. They tell of fewer hands shaping the landscape and of a society transitioning away from the practice rhythms that had defined it for generations. Environmental stress figures prominently in the story. Pollen cores from nearby wetlands show a steep decline in forest cover around the city's environs, indicating extensive clearing for fields, building materials, and fuel. Maize became an ever more dominant component of the diet, and that reliance placed tremendous pressure on soils that had been farmed intensively. Soil chemistry studies indicate nutrient depletion in agricultural plots close to the mounds. Tree ring sequences and regional climate proxies point to episodes of multi-year drought interspersed with intense flooding. Such swings would have strained food production. One season of failed crops might be survived. Repeated failures undermined confidence in the institutions that had organized food storage, distribution, and ritual reciprocity. Social and political strains amplified ecological pressures. As signs of stress accumulated, communities commonly turned inward. At Cahokia, the archaeological record shows construction of defensive palisades at various times, a visible sign that conflict, or at least the fear of it, had become more salient. Human remains in several contexts bear marks consistent with violent death and trauma. Some burials, formerly elaborate and sacral in nature, were later disturbed or intentionally altered, which suggests episodes of internal upheaval or the collapse of elite authority. The great central mound that once held elite burials and offerings eventually lay fallow, its care ceased. When leadership cannot guarantee security or nourishment, allegiance frays. People begin to seek new arrangements. Trade networks that had knit the Mississippian world together also show signs of disruption. Exotic raw materials and finished goods that had flowed into Cahokia in abundance become rarer in the upper layers of occupation. Shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, and other long-distance items decline in frequency. Reduced exchange narrowed dietary and material options and limited the elite's capacity to reinforce social bonds through gift-giving and ceremonial displays. When exchange dwindles, so does the ideological glue that had supported centralized authority. Smaller, more autonomous communities often re-emerge in such contexts, reorienting around local resources rather than superregional prestige. The archaeological horizon after the decline tells of dispersal and adaptation. Houses that once clustered tightly near the core appear in increasing numbers on the periphery and then beyond. Some inhabitants move to upland zones where soils were less depleted and risks of catastrophic flooding lower. Other groups may have integrated with neighboring chiefdoms or formed new alliances. Ceremonial life did not vanish overnight, rather, it changed in scale and form. Smaller mounds and plazas continued to be used for a time at a regional level, but the conspicuous monumental building that defined the urban center faded. In many ways, abandonment was a process of reconfiguration rather than a simple desertion. Archaeologists have documented particular episodes that encapsulate these broader patterns. Layered deposits of ash and burnt materials in some domestic and public spaces suggest that fires, accidental or intentional, punctuated the city's decline. Certain plazas and structures show signs of being hastily burned and then left. Such evidence could indicate conflict, ritual termination of buildings, or catastrophic environmental events that made occupation untenable. Where once coordinated labor had raised massive earthen constructions, later generations left only scattered, irregular work. The organized choreography of a large urban center unraveled into smaller, local projects. Material traces also reveal changes in diet and health. Stable isotope analyses of human bones show increasing reliance on maize and, in some cases, nutritional stress markers. Dental pathology and bone growth interruptions in juveniles hint at episodic malnutrition or disease stress. These biological signatures are corroborated by a reduction in the variety of faunal remains recovered from later deposits. A narrower subsistence base made populations more vulnerable to the swings of climate and yield, and more dependent on stored food or trade, both of which became less reliable. Cultural transformations manifest alongside these physical shifts. The motifs and craft styles that once signaled a shared Mississippian cosmology grow less uniform across the site and region. Local styles proliferate. This artistic diversification indicates that local identities strengthened as centralizing rituals and the economic power of Cahokia waned. Breakdowns in shared ceremonial life meant fewer occasions for reaffirming broad social ties. Instead, communities consolidated around kin networks and the immediate landscape. Such a shift is common in the archaeological record when centralized power disperses. The end of Cahokia as a dense urban center did not mean the disappearance of its people or culture. Descendant communities continued to live in the broader Mississippi Valley, adapting traditions to new settings. Oral histories of descendant nations and ethnographic parallels suggest continuity in elements of social memory, even when the urban framework was gone. People carried techniques, stories, and sacred practices into new contexts, reshaping them to meet different ecological and political circumstances. This continuity reminds us that abandonment of a city need not equal cultural extinction. In the final chapters of occupation, the plaza's once sweeping lines filled with leaf litter and sediment. Mounds that had been regraded and maintained began their long course back into the prairie. The river that had fed and threatened the city continued its course, it reworked the floodplain and reshaped human opportunities. Eventually, the monument complex that had been a beacon of central authority and elaborate ritual stood mostly silent. The memory of its scale persisted in the landscape, a palimpsest of labor and belief, but the human bustle that had given it meaning had moved elsewhere. Modern archaeological practice continues to revise and deepen our understanding of why Cahokia declined. New methods, from microscopic soil analysis to refined isotopic techniques and high-resolution climate reconstructions, provide subtler pictures of interplay among environment, economy, and politics. Yet the broad contours remain: a flourishing urban center, sustained by intensive agriculture and complex social organization, confronted cascading stresses. Ecological limits, climate variability, political fragmentation, and disruptions to exchange combined in ways that made continued occupation at the same scale increasingly untenable. There is a lesson in the quiet layers left beneath the grass atop the mounds. Human societies can create astonishing concentrations of labor and creativity. They can also strain the systems that support them. Cahokia's decline unfolded over generations, and it carried with it human stories of resilience, migration, conflict, and reinvention. Those who left did not vanish, they adapted. Those who stayed repurposed what remained. The city's abandonment was thus not an end to human agency, but a transformation in how people lived, organized, and remembered. Thank you for listening. If you would like more narratives that explore the subtleties of ancient places and how they changed through time, please consider subscribing for future projects. Legacy and Archaeology Today. Hello. When archaeologists first began careful, systematic study of the earthen terraces and mounded outlines around the Mississippi floodplain, they found a civic and ceremonial heartland whose imprint still shapes how we study complex societies in North America. Monk's Mound rises above the site as a monument to engineering and social organization, and the reconstructed rings of posts known as Woodhinge offer a tangible sense of how people at Cahokia tracked the passage of seasons. Archaeological fieldwork and museum displays have moved far beyond mere excavation. They now form a layered conversation between soil chemistry, remote sensing, museum curation, and the living descendants of the continent's indigenous peoples. Researchers today deploy LIDAR and ground-penetrating radar to read buried landscapes without tearing them open. These methods have revealed traces of house patterns, pit features, and palisade lines that were invisible beneath forest canopy or plowed fields. Soil phosphorus mapping and magnetic gradiometry pick out areas of intense activity, plazas where feasting left chemical signatures, and workshops where stone and shell were transformed into tools and ritual objects. Specialists in archaeobotany and zooarchaeology study charred seeds and animal bones to reconstruct diets, trade, and seasonal rhythms. Isotopic analysis of human teeth and bone can indicate movements of people and the varieties of foods they consumed. Together, these techniques build a multidimensional picture, not just what was made and where, but how communities moved, ate, and organized themselves through time. Museums and interpretive centers have reshaped how the public encounters Cahokia's legacy. Visitors walk paths that trace the plaza alignments and climb viewing platforms to see the scale of Monk's Mound. Exhibits display pottery, carved stone, shell ornaments, and copper artifacts, small objects that speak to wide networks of exchange across the continent. Artifact conservation follows rigorous standards, and curators contextualize finds with three-dimensional models and interactive displays that explain manufacturing techniques and social meanings. The reconstructed Woodhinge serves both as a learning tool and as an emblem of continuity, a simple set of posts that anchors astronomical and ceremonial practices to the landscape in a way a glass case cannot. Legal and ethical frameworks have reshaped archaeological practice at Cahokia and sites like it. Laws that require consultation with Native American tribes and that mandate the repatriation of human remains and certain cultural objects have altered museum inventories and field protocols. Collaboration is increasingly central. Descendant communities, scholarly institutions, and site managers engage in dialogue about exhibition narratives, burial treatments, and research priorities. This is not merely bureaucratic, it changes what questions are asked in the field and how findings are interpreted in public spaces. Community-led programs bring Indigenous knowledge into visitor programming and classroom curricula, connecting contemporary cultural practices to a deep, shared past. Public archaeology and education programs extend beyond the site's boundaries into classrooms and digital spaces. School groups participate in mock excavations and hands-on workshops that teach stratigraphy and typology. Online portals host datasets, artifact catalogs, and 3D scans that allow researchers and the public worldwide to study material culture remotely. Academic partnerships support internships and citizen science projects that invite non-specialists to help transcribe archival records or to survey landscape features under professional supervision. These initiatives democratize access to data while maintaining rigorous documentation standards. Preservation remains an ongoing challenge, complicated by urban expansion, agriculture, and the natural processes that reshape the floodplain. Development pressure has historically threatened peripheral areas, and archaeological advocacy continues to seek protective easements and thoughtful land management. Climate and hydrological changes add another layer of concern. Erosion and changing water tables can expose or destabilize buried contexts. Conservation strategies now integrate landscape-scale planning, balancing public access and educational uses with the long-term protection of fragile soils and buried deposits. Archaeologists also confront the legacy of earlier practices: unrecorded looting, poor documentation of excavated collections, and interpretive biases that marginalized indigenous voices. Modern fieldwork emphasizes meticulous recording, digital archiving, and transparency. Case studies show how reinvestigation of archived materials, from field notes to small artifacts stored in museum basements, can yield new insights when reanalyzed with contemporary methods. For example, typological reassessment and microscopic wear analysis of chipped stone tools can reveal production sequences and trade connections that earlier scholars missed. That kind of slow, cumulative work is now standard in building the narrative of Cahokia's enduring influence. The site's status as a point of international and national recognition has elevated its role in public memory. It stands not only as an archaeological treasure but as a focal point for conversations about pre-contact complexity in North America. Educators use Cahokia as a corrective against outdated narratives that underestimated the scale and sophistication of indigenous polities. In classrooms and lecture halls, the site becomes evidence for urbanism, craft specialization, and regional interaction long before European contact reshaped the continent's human landscape. Scholarly debates persist, and they are healthy. Some conversations revolve around the nature of Cahokia's political organization and how ceremonial centers related to smaller satellite settlements. Others probe the environmental management strategies that supported large populations on the floodplain. Each new season of fieldwork and each novel application of scientific analysis adds texture, and sometimes new puzzles, to our understanding. The questions become more refined over time, and so do the answers. Finally, there is the human dimension beyond the artifacts and geophysics, the ways in which Cahokia resonates with contemporary communities. Indigenous artists and scholars draw inspiration from the motifs and technologies uncovered at the site, creating works that speak to continuity and revival. Local heritage organizations host cultural events that weave together traditional practices and modern educational aims. These practices reinforce Cahokia's living legacy, reminding us that archaeology is not only about studying the past but also about nurturing relationships in the present. If this account deepened your appreciation for the ongoing work at Cahokia, please consider subscribing for more narratives that explore archaeological practice and heritage stewardship. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me on this quiet passage back in time. As the light fades over the broad shoulders of Monk's Mound, we carry with us the outlines of a city once alive with purpose, a bustling center on the river, ordered plazas and earthen pyramids, the great wood hinge marking seasons and ceremonies, and thousands of lives woven together by cornfields, trade routes, and ritual. Cahokia was not a curiosity at the edge of history but a deliberate, sophisticated capital of the Mississippian world, a place of engineering, social complexity, and spiritual intensity. Archaeology has shown us its scale: vast mounds rising from a planned landscape, evidence of long-distance exchange, and the rhythms of daily life hinging on agriculture and communal labor. The reasons for its decline are not simple: environmental stress, shifting waterways, social upheaval, and changing climate each left a mark. Yet the story also includes resilience, memory, and the ongoing presence of descendant indigenous peoples whose histories and voices must guide how we interpret this place. You and First have walked this story together, imagining the smoke from domestic hearths, the drumbeats in the plaza, and the conversations of leaders who shaped a continent's destiny. That sense of connection, between past and present, between people and place, is the true inheritance of Cahokia. If this journey moved you, consider subscribing to receive more calm, careful explorations of ancient North America. In future episodes we will travel to other Mississippian centers, listen to indigenous scholars who illuminate these histories, and follow new archaeological discoveries that reshape what we thought we knew. We will also examine the science of tree rings and sediments that reveal changing climates, and the efforts to protect and remember these landscapes. May the mounds remain, silent but speaking, and may our study of them be guided by respect, curiosity, and duty. Thank you for watching.